A little girl's whispered words about her stepmom throwing away her birthday cake would forever change the course of many lives that day. Nobody expected such a simple confession to attract the attention of someone with the power to transform their reality in an instant. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The summer breeze drifted through the open windows of the small cottage by the riverside, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the distant laughter of children playing. It should have been a day of celebration for Lucy, a day where candles would be blown out with wishes whispered into the air. Instead, the small girl sat quietly at the worn kitchen table, her fingers absently brushing away cake crumbs, the only evidence that today was meant to be special. "I've told you before about wasting luxuries," Evelyn hissed, her voice sharp enough to make Lucy flinch. "Do you think money grows on trees? That cake cost good pounds that could have gone to the church fund?" Lucy's eyes remained fixed on the wooden tabletop, tracing the patterns in the grain as her stepmother continued her tirade. The small chocolate cake with its single candle, the one Lucy had been saving her pocket money for weeks to buy from Thomas's bakery, was now being unceremoniously scraped into the bin. "But it's my birthday," Lucy whispered, her voice barely audible over the humming of the old refrigerator. Her small fingers curled around the edge of the table, knuckles white with the effort of holding back tears. Evelyn's face contorted with irritation. "Birthdays are for children who deserve them. Perhaps if you'd finished your chores properly, or helped with the church committee like I asked." "Stepmom threw away my birthday cake," Lucy murmured, not to Evelyn, but to herself, a quiet acknowledgement of a truth that stung more than any scolding could. The words hung in the air, seemingly lost in the ambient sounds of the cottage, but they had not gone unheard. A shadow fell across the kitchen floor. Jonathan Albright stood silently in the doorway, his tall figure imposing against the afternoon light. In his hands was an envelope, a donation for the church fund he had personally decided to deliver. The reclusive millionaire rarely ventured into town, making his presence in the humble cottage all the more startling. Evelyn froze mid-sentence, the color draining from her face as she recognized the visitor. Her hand, still holding the spatula with cake remnants, trembled slightly. "Mr. Albright," she stammered, her voice suddenly honeyed. "What a surprise! I wasn't expecting—" Jonathan's gaze shifted from Evelyn to the small girl at the table, then to the cake scraps visible in the bin. His expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes hardened. The air in the kitchen seemed to change, charged with an unspoken tension and the possibility of something new. Lucy looked up, meeting the stranger's eyes briefly before looking away. She didn't know who this man was, but she felt the shift in the atmosphere, like the moment before a storm breaks, when everything holds its breath in anticipation. News travels faster than light in small English towns, and by tea-time, every household knew that Jonathan Albright had been spotted at Evelyn's cottage. Mrs. Henderson from across the lane was the first to notice, nearly spilling her watering can as she glimpsed the imposing figure of the reclusive millionaire standing in Evelyn's doorway. "Did you hear?" she whispered frantically into her mobile phone. "Jonathan Albright himself, at Evelyn's place." Within the hour, curtains twitched along the riverside as neighbors peered out, hoping to catch a glimpse of the town's most mysterious resident. Jonathan rarely ventured from his sprawling mansion on the hill, and when he did, it was usually for church donations or brief business matters, never for social calls. What business could he possibly have with her? Wondered Thomas as he kneaded dough in his bakery. The flour-dusted man shook his head, remembering little Lucy's downcast eyes when she'd visited his shop earlier. Something didn't add up. At the post office, theories multiplied like rabbits. "Perhaps he's considering her for a position at the estate," suggested the postmistress. "Or maybe it's about that charity committee she's always talking about." "Nonsense," countered an elderly gentleman collecting his pension. "Albright doesn't trust anyone with his affairs except Clara." Been that way since his wife passed. In a community where reputations were built over decades and destroyed in seconds, Jonathan's unexpected appearance created ripples that threatened to become waves. Evelyn had spent years carefully cultivating her image as the town's most charitable stepmother, always first to volunteer at church functions and quick to mention her sacrifices for poor dear Lucy. But now that carefully constructed facade faced scrutiny. Several women at the hair salon recalled how Lucy always seemed withdrawn, wearing the same clothes season after season, while Evelyn dressed impeccably. Others remembered the child's birthday last year. No party, no friends invited, despite Evelyn's claims of planning something special. Meanwhile, Lucy sat alone on the stone wall behind the cottage, unaware that she had become the subject of the town's whispers. She traced patterns in the dirt with a stick, wondering if Jonathan had truly seen what happened with her cake, or if she had imagined his presence in the doorway. As evening approached, Evelyn paced her sitting room, phone pressed to her ear. "Margaret, you don't understand," she hissed to her cousin. "If Albright says anything about what he saw, we need to control this narrative immediately." The truth hung in the balance, caught between a child's whispered heartbreak and a town too accustomed to believing appearances over reality. Jonathan Albright paced the length of his study, the evening light casting long shadows across the polished floor. The scene at Evelyn's cottage replayed in his mind. The discarded cake, the little girl's downcast eyes, the stepmother's harsh words. He paused by the window, gazing out at the manicured gardens of his mansion that had once felt like a sanctuary, but now seemed more like a prison of his own making. "You've barely touched your tea," Clara observed, entering the room with quiet efficiency. The housekeeper had served him for 15 years, long enough to read the troubled expression on his face. "I saw something today," he said, his voice low. "That woman, Evelyn, she threw away her stepdaughter's birthday cake, called it a waste of money." His fingers tightened around the curtain. The child just stood there, accepting it like she expected nothing better. Clara set down the silver tray. "Lucy, the little one. Poor dear. There have been whispers in town." Jonathan turned, surprised. "You know of her?" "Small towns keep few secrets," she replied, "except perhaps yours." The millionaire sighed heavily. His wealth had built walls that kept others at a distance, exactly as he'd intended after Elizabeth's death and the betrayal that followed. Intervening in Lucy's life would mean stepping back into the community that had once wounded him so deeply. "I should do something," he muttered, more to himself than to Clara. "Like what happened with the Brennan boy?" Clara asked gently. Jonathan flinched. 5 years ago he'd tried to help a troubled child, only to have his intentions twisted by gossip and suspicion. The experience had driven him further into isolation. "I can't risk that again," he said. "The town would assume they always do." Clara approached, her weathered hands folding a napkin with practiced precision. Perhaps direct intervention isn't needed yet. Observation first. Understanding. Jonathan considered her words. Clara had lost her own child years before coming to work for him, a grief she rarely mentioned, but that informed her compassion. "You're suggesting I watch over her from a distance?" "For now," Clara nodded. "The right moment to act will present itself." Something in her calm certainty steadied him. Jonathan moved to his desk and sat down, pulling out a leather-bound notebook. "I'll need to know more about her situation. About Evelyn." "I can help with that," Clara offered. As night fell over the riverside town, Jonathan made his decision. He would observe, gather information, and prepare. This time he wouldn't rush in only to retreat. This time he would be strategic in his kindness. "Very well," he said finally. "We'll watch and wait." The evening shadows stretched long across the cobblestone streets as Lucy made her way toward Thomas's bakery. The warm glow from its windows beckoned like a lighthouse in the gathering dusk, promising comfort her cottage no longer provided. The scent of fresh bread and sweet pastries wafted through the air, drawing her forward with each hesitant step. Thomas Baker looked up from behind the counter when the small bell above his door announced her arrival. His keen eyes immediately registered the girl's downcast expression and the slight redness around her eyes. Lucy stood quietly by the display case, her small fingers barely touching the glass as she gazed at the colorful array of treats she knew she couldn't afford. "Evening, Lucy," Thomas said gently, wiping flour from his hands onto his apron. "Bit late to be out on your own, isn't it?" She nodded without meeting his gaze. "Stepmom said I could have some air before bedtime." The baker had heard whispers about Evelyn's treatment of her stepdaughter. The town gossip mill turned relentlessly, and Thomas had caught fragments about a birthday and tears. He glanced through the window, checking if anyone was watching. In a small English town like theirs, kindness could be misconstrued, especially toward a child not your own. "I've got some tarts that won't keep till morning," he said casually, selecting a small raspberry one from behind the counter. "Would be a shame to waste them." Lucy's eyes widened as Thomas wrapped the pastry in wax paper and handed it to her. "I don't have any money," she whispered. "Consider it payment for brightening my shop," the baker replied with a wink. Sometimes a smile is worth more than pounds. Lucy clutched the package to her chest, a tentative smile breaking through her sadness like sunlight through clouds. "Thank you, Mr. Baker." Thomas watched her hurry away, knowing his small kindness might fuel gossip tomorrow. Yet seeing that flicker of joy in her eyes made any potential consequences worthwhile. Back in her tiny bedroom at the cottage, Lucy carefully unwrapped her treasure. Before taking a bite, she noticed something on her windowsill, a forgotten birthday candle she'd managed to salvage from the bin after Evelyn had discarded her cake. The small girl picked it up, studying its colorful wax. With determined fingers, Lucy pressed the candle into the center of the tart. She found a match in the kitchen drawer and, returning to her room, lit the tiny flame. In its gentle glow, she closed her eyes and made a wish, not for presents or parties, but for more moments like this one, where kindness found her despite everything. The candle's light flickered against her bedroom wall, a small but defiant symbol of hope, not yet extinguished. The summer fair transformed the riverside town square into a kaleidoscope of color and sound. Bunting fluttered between lampposts, and paper lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze. Children darted between stalls of candied apples and homemade fudge, while adults gathered in clusters, exchanging the latest gossip over cups of sweet cider. Lucy stood at the edge of a small group of children, her thin shoulders hunched slightly as she watched them trade stories about their favorite birthday celebrations. One boy boasted about a trip to London, another about a pony ride. When they finally noticed her, a girl with pigtails asked, "What about you, Lucy? What did you get for your birthday?" The question hung in the air. Lucy twisted the hem of her dress, Thomas's kindness from the bakery still warm in her memory. Something in that small act of compassion had planted a seed of courage. "I didn't get anything," she said softly. "My stepmom threw away my birthday cake." The words fell like stones into still water. The children's chatter ceased immediately. A mother standing nearby turned, her hand frozen midway to her mouth. The ripple of silence spread outward, conversation dying as the revelation passed from person to person. "She said it was a waste of money," Lucy continued, her voice growing steadier. "She put it in the bin while I was watching." Evelyn, who had been chatting animatedly with the vicar's wife about her recent church donation, sensed the shift in atmosphere. She turned to see a circle of shocked faces, all eyes moving between her and her stepdaughter. The color drained from her face before quickly being replaced by an indignant flush. "Lucy!" Evelyn strode forward, her voice honeyed with false concern but eyes flashing warning. "What stories are you telling now? You know very well that cake was spoiled. Remember, it had been left out all night." She placed a firm hand on Lucy's shoulder, fingers digging in slightly. "My stepdaughter has such an imagination," she announced to the gathering crowd. "The baker sold us a stale cake, and when I discovered it was inedible, I had to discard it." Lucy was upset naturally, but making up tales won't bring it back. The girl shrank under her stepmother's grip, but her eyes remained steady, meeting the gaze of an elderly woman who frowned in concern. "Such a shame about the cake," Evelyn continued, her voice rising to ensure everyone heard. "Especially after all the trouble I went to, organizing a party no one could attend. Children can be so ungrateful when disappointed." As she steered Lucy away from the group, Jonathan Albright watched from the shadow of the oak tree, his tall figure unnoticed by the crowd. The millionaire's jaw tightened as he observed the performance, seeing clearly through Evelyn's hastily constructed defense. The congregation of St. Andrew's Church erupted in applause as Evelyn handed over a check for £500. She bowed her head demurely, a practiced gesture of humility that complemented her carefully selected outfit. Modest, yet clearly expensive. Reverend Phillips thanked her profusely, mentioning how the donation would help repair the church roof before winter. "It's the least I can do," Evelyn replied, her voice carrying just far enough for the cluster of townsfolk by the entrance to hear. "We must all contribute to our community, especially those of us blessed with enough to share." Several women nodded, approvingly. Margaret, standing nearby, made sure to comment loudly about her cousin's generosity. The timing of the donation, just 3 days after the summer fair incident, was lost on no one, yet few dared question the sudden burst of charity. Later that afternoon, Evelyn sat with her friends at the Riverside Cafe, stirring her tea with deliberate slowness. "I worry so much about Lucy," she confided, her voice a perfect blend of concern and resignation. "Children with difficult pasts often struggle with truth-telling. Her therapist says it's a coping mechanism. The lie slipped out effortlessly. Lucy had never seen a therapist, but the women around the table nodded sympathetically, already revising their opinions of the fair incident. "Poor dear," said one, patting Evelyn's hand. "You're so patient with her." "It must be exhausting," added another. Back at the cottage, Evelyn's demeanor changed entirely. She found Lucy reading quietly in her small bedroom and stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "I fixed the mess you made," she said coldly. "Next time you decide to embarrass me in public, remember who provides your food and shelter." Lucy looked up, her small face unreadable. "Yes, Evelyn," she whispered. That evening, Evelyn made 3 phone calls. By morning, new whispers circulated through the town. Lucy had behavioral problems at her previous school. Her father had left because of her difficult nature. The birthday cake story was merely her latest fabrication. The strategy worked brilliantly. When Lucy walked to Thomas's bakery the following day, Mrs. Bennett from the flower shop gave her a suspicious glance. The postman, usually friendly, merely nodded curtly. Only Clara, watching from across the street as she completed errands for Jonathan Albright, noticed the girl's hunched shoulders and downcast eyes. The housekeeper frowned, making a mental note to mention this to her employer. Something wasn't right with that child, and Clara had learned long ago to trust her instincts about such matters. Jonathan Albright stood in his study, dust motes dancing in the afternoon light as he supervised Clara's careful organization of his papers. The housekeeper moved with practiced efficiency, her hands gentle with the weathered documents that chronicled his life. "These haven't been touched in years," Clara remarked, lifting a stack of correspondence from the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. "Perhaps it's time to sort through them properly." Jonathan nodded absently, his mind still occupied with the image of Lucy's downcast eyes at the summer fair. He'd kept his distance since witnessing Evelyn's cruelty, uncertain how to proceed without causing more harm. As Clara arranged the papers, a cream-colored envelope slipped free, landing at Jonathan's feet. The handwriting struck him immediately, elegant curves he would recognize anywhere. Elizabeth's writing. "Sir?" Clara paused, noticing his sudden stillness. With trembling fingers, Jonathan retrieved the envelope. It had been sealed for 5 years, addressed simply, "For when you're ready to begin again." He broke the seal, unfolding the delicate stationery that still carried the faintest trace of his late wife's perfume. "My dearest Jonathan," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I've been gone some time. You've mourned, you've withdrawn, and perhaps you've forgotten the man you truly are." His throat tightened as he continued reading Elizabeth's words, written during her final days. "Your heart has always been your greatest strength, not your weakness. Remember our dream of filling our home with children's laughter? Don't abandon that dream because I'm gone. Somewhere, a child needs the love and protection only you can provide. This is my final wish. Find that child, Jonathan. Let compassion guide you once more." Clara watched silently as tears gathered in her employer's eyes. She had served the Albrights for 20 years, witnessing their joy, their heartbreak, and the slow calcification of Jonathan's spirit after Elizabeth's passing. "She knew me better than I knew myself," Jonathan whispered, carefully refolding the letter. "Mrs. Albright always did," Clara agreed softly. "She would have adored little Lucy." The mention of the child's name crystallized something in Jonathan's mind. The parallel was unmistakable. A child in need, just as Elizabeth had foreseen. His previous hesitation seemed suddenly foolish, a betrayal of Elizabeth's memory and his own better nature. "I failed once before," he admitted, remembering his abandoned attempt to adopt after Elizabeth's death. "I couldn't bear to love and lose again." Clara's weathered hand touched his arm briefly. "Perhaps this time it's not about what you might lose, but what you both might gain." Jonathan tucked the letter into his pocket, its weight against his heart both burden and balm. The memory of past failures no longer paralyzed him. Instead, it fueled his determination. Lucy would not be abandoned to Evelyn's cruelty, not while he had the power to act. Margaret Worthington had always considered herself a woman of opportunity. When whispers of Jonathan Albright's sudden reappearance in town affairs reached her ears, she immediately recognized a chance too valuable to ignore. The reclusive millionaire had wealth, status, and, most importantly, was unmarried. A charity tea gathering would be perfect, Margaret announced to Evelyn over afternoon tea at the cottage. "We'll invite the most respectable families, and of course Jonathan must attend." Her cousin nodded approvingly. An excellent idea. The church restoration fund is always in need. 3 days later, Margaret's parlor was adorned with her finest china and freshly cut flowers. She had strategically arranged the seating to ensure Jonathan would be placed beside her. As guests arrived in their Sunday best, Margaret greeted each with practiced charm, her eyes constantly darting to the door. When Jonathan finally entered, accompanied by Clara, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The housekeeper stood slightly behind him, her protective presence unmistakable. "Mr. Albright, how wonderful you could join us," Margaret cooed, guiding him to his seat. "We're raising funds for the church roof. Such a worthy cause." Jonathan nodded politely, his expression revealing little. Indeed, Lucy arrived shortly after with Evelyn, who had insisted the child attend to demonstrate their family unity. The girl sat quietly in the corner, her small frame almost disappearing into the ornate chair. As tea progressed, Margaret ensured the conversation highlighted her charitable endeavors. "I've always believed in helping those truly deserving," she said pointedly, glancing toward Lucy. Then came the moment Margaret had carefully orchestrated. "Lucy, dear," she called across the room, silencing other conversations. "Tell everyone about your birthday celebration. Evelyn mentioned what a lovely cake she prepared." The child froze, eyes widening. Every head turned toward her. I didn't have a celebration," Lucy whispered. "Nonsense," Margaret countered with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Children and their imagination." Evelyn spent hours baking that cake. Jonathan's posture stiffened. He watched Lucy's face crumple with humiliation as Evelyn smoothly interjected with a fabricated tale of an ungrateful child who had rejected her stepmother's efforts. "Some children simply cannot appreciate kindness," Margaret added, patting Evelyn's hand sympathetically. Throughout the remainder of the gathering, Jonathan observed the subtle cruelty beneath the polite smiles and gentle laughter. The wealthy man barely touched his tea, his discomfort growing with each passing minute. When Lucy was sent to fetch more napkins, he noticed how the adult's eyes followed her with judgment, rather than compassion. As the afternoon drew to a close, Jonathan made his excuses and departed earlier than expected. Margaret's scheme had succeeded in bringing him to her home, but failed entirely in its true objective. Clara found Lucy sitting cross-legged on the floor of the mansion's sunroom, surrounded by colored pencils and paper. The housekeeper paused in the doorway, watching as the small girl's hands moved across the page, sketching what appeared to be an elaborate birthday cake with candles and decorations. "That's quite beautiful," Clara said softly, stepping into the room. "May I see?" Lucy nodded, her eyes downcast as she pushed the drawing forward. The page revealed not just one cake, but an entire collection of celebration scenes. Birthday parties she had never experienced, with smiling stick figures gathered around tables laden with treats. "These are all the birthdays I wish I had," the child whispered, her fingers tracing the paper. "Thomas says everyone deserves a proper celebration." Clara settled beside Lucy, her weathered hands smoothing her apron. "He's right, you know. The baker has always had a kind heart." She picked up one of the drawings, studying the careful details. "I had a little one once, about your age." Lucy looked up, curiosity brightening her eyes. "You did? Where are they now?" "Gone," Clara said, her voice catching. "My Emily caught fever one winter. The doctors couldn't save her." She touched a small locket hidden beneath her collar. "That's why I worry so much about you, I suppose." Later that evening, after Lucy had been tucked into bed, Clara found Jonathan in his study, staring absently at the fire. "She was drawing birthday cakes," the housekeeper said without preamble. "Dozens of them. All the celebrations Evelyn never allowed her." Jonathan Albright turned, his imposing figure silhouetted against the flames. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her about Emily." Clara's voice wavered. "I've never spoken of my daughter to anyone in this house before." The millionaire's expression softened. "Clara, I had no idea. It's been 15 years, she replied. "But seeing Lucy, the way her stepmother treats her, it brings it all back. I couldn't protect my child, but perhaps I can help this one." Jonathan moved to the window, gazing out at the darkened town. "I fear becoming attached only to fail her," he admitted, "as I failed before." "The adoption," Clara nodded. "But this is different. You're different now." "Am I?" he asked. "You wouldn't be tormented by this if you weren't," she said firmly. "We've both lost something precious, but that pain can guide us to do better. Lucy shouldn't suffer alone, not when we have the power to help." Jonathan's reflection in the window glass showed a man wrestling with his fears, but as he turned back to Clara, Something in his eyes had changed, a resolve taking shape, born from shared grief and the possibility of healing. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "we begin." Thomas's bakery had always been a haven of warmth and comfort in the riverside town. The scent of fresh bread and sweet pastries typically drew a steady stream of customers through its weathered door. But lately, the bell above the entrance chimed less frequently. Word had spread about the baker's kindness toward Lucy, and many townsfolk, swayed by Evelyn's carefully crafted narrative, began to avoid the establishment. "Another slow morning," Thomas murmured, wiping flour from his hands as he peered through the window at the nearly empty street. The display cases, once emptied by midday, remained full of untouched goods. He had noticed the whispers when customers did enter, hushed conversations about how he was encouraging that troublesome child and undermining proper discipline. Lucy slipped into the bakery one afternoon, her small frame seeming to shrink further under the weight of guilt. "Is it my fault?" she asked, watching Thomas arrange pastries that would likely remain unsold. The baker shook his head, offering a gentle smile. "People make their own choices, Lucy, and I've made mine." Though his voice remained steady, the worry lines around his eyes had deepened. With bills mounting and ingredients going to waste, Thomas feared he might have to close the shop that had been his life's work. Jonathan Albright observed this situation with growing concern. One evening, after confirming the bakery was empty of customers, he entered through the back door. "Your kindness shouldn't cost you your livelihood," the millionaire stated plainly, placing a small envelope on the counter. Thomas started to protest, his pride evident in his squared shoulders, but Jonathan raised a hand. "This isn't charity. It's an investment in integrity, something increasingly rare in this town." The following day, Lucy arrived at the bakery with an idea. "What if we make the window so beautiful people can't help but come inside?" she suggested, her eyes brightening with possibility. Together, they transformed the bakery's facade. Thomas taught Lucy how to create delicate sugar decorations, while she contributed colorful drawings to place alongside the pastries. They crafted an autumn harvest display that celebrated the season's bounty, complete with miniature bread sculptures and pastries shaped like falling leaves. The display caught attention. First came the children, pressing their noses against the glass. Then parents followed, initially hesitant but ultimately unable to resist the artistry and the delicious aromas. Even those who had avoided the shop found themselves drawn in by the beauty of the collaboration. Clara stopped by one afternoon, smiling at the renewed activity. "Sometimes," she said quietly to Thomas as she purchased a loaf, "standing firm in kindness is its own reward." By week's end, the bell above the door chimed regularly again. The bakery had become not just a place to purchase bread, but a symbol of resilience against the tide of gossip that threatened to drown the truth. Autumn leaves scattered across the cobblestone streets as the town's scrutiny of Evelyn intensified. The crisp October air carried whispers that reached even the most secluded corners of the riverside community. What few knew was that Evelyn's cruelty toward Lucy had roots in her own childhood trauma. At the age of 9, Evelyn had experienced a birthday humiliation that scarred her deeply. Her parents, obsessed with appearances much like she now was, had invited the entire neighborhood to celebrate. When only 3 children appeared, her father had blamed her, calling her unlikable in front of everyone. The cake, a lavish creation her mother had spent days perfecting, became a symbol of waste and disappointment rather than joy. "You'll never be worth the expense," her father had muttered, slicing the cake with angry precision while guests pretended not to notice her tears. This memory festered in Evelyn's heart, transforming over decades into a twisted belief that celebrations were merely opportunities for rejection. Each time she saw Lucy's hopeful face, she relived her own childhood shame. The birthday cake she had thrown away was not just Lucy's. It was her own past she was desperately trying to discard. As autumn progressed, Evelyn's obsession with maintaining her charitable image grew more frantic. She doubled her church donations, volunteered conspicuously at community events, and spoke loudly about her challenges with her stepdaughter whenever Jonathan Albright might be within earshot. Yet cracks in her facade were beginning to show. Mrs. Pemberton from the church committee recalled that Evelyn had claimed Lucy was prone to lies about her 10th birthday, yet earlier had mentioned the child was only turning 8. Thomas noticed how she spoke of Lucy's expensive schooling, while the girl wore the same worn cardigan day after day. "Something doesn't add up with that woman," the baker muttered to Clara one morning as she collected bread for Jonathan's household. Jonathan himself had begun quietly investigating Evelyn's background, discovering a pattern of short-lived marriages and abrupt departures from previous communities. His findings troubled him deeply, especially as Lucy grew increasingly withdrawn. The autumn wind seemed to carry change with it. As the red and gold leaves swirled around the town square, the carefully constructed story Evelyn had built began to unravel thread by thread. Her past was catching up, just as the town's collective conscience was awakening to the quiet suffering of the small, resilient child who never complained about her missing birthday cake. The autumn market transformed the town square into a tapestry of amber and crimson, wooden stalls laden with harvest bounty-lined cobblestone paths, while fallen leaves crunched underfoot. Lucy wandered between vendors, momentarily forgetting her troubles as she admired handcrafted trinkets and breathed in the scent of cinnamon and apples. Her momentary peace shattered when she heard Evelyn's voice drifting from behind a nearby stall. Lucy instinctively stepped behind a display of pumpkins, making herself small and invisible, a skill she had perfected in her stepmother's home. "She's becoming more trouble than she's worth," Evelyn was saying to someone Lucy couldn't see. "My cousin in Sheffield has agreed to take her after Christmas. I've convinced everyone it's for her education, but honestly, I'll be relieved to have the problem child out of my hair." Lucy's heart plummeted. Sheffield was hours away. She would lose Thomas's kindness, Clara's gentle smiles, and any protection Jonathan Albright might offer. The child clutched a small wooden toy she'd been examining, her knuckles white with fear. "Are you all right, dear?" asked an elderly stallkeeper, noticing her distress. Lucy nodded quickly, replacing the toy and slipping away. She decided to keep this terrible discovery to herself. Who would believe her? Over Evelyn's carefully crafted explanations? Besides, revealing what she'd overheard might only accelerate her banishment. Across the market, Jonathan moved through the crowd with unusual visibility. The normally reclusive millionaire nodded at townspeople who stared in surprise at his presence. Clara had encouraged him to attend, sensing Lucy might need watching over. "Something troubles the child," Jonathan murmured to his housekeeper as they observed Lucy from a distance. The girl's shoulders were hunched, her movements hesitant as she navigated the festive throng. Clara nodded. "Evelyn's been particularly sharp with her this week. I heard her on the telephone yesterday, speaking about arrangements of some kind." The autumn breeze carried fragments of conversation around them. Whispers about Evelyn's charitable donations contrasted with growing suspicions about her treatment of Lucy. The town's festive atmosphere was undercut by these currents of tension. "I fear she's planning something," Jonathan said, his voice low and concerned. "We must be vigilant." As dusk approached, lanterns illuminated the market. Lucy sat alone on a bench, watching children play with their parents. When Thomas appeared with a small pastry wrapped in paper, she accepted it with a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Sheffield is very far away," she whispered to herself when no one could hear, a single tear sliding down her cheek as market revelry continued around her. The crackling fire did little to warm Jonathan Albright's study as a rain lashed against the windows. He sat across from Clara, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone cold, his thoughts even colder. "I've never told anyone this," Jonathan said, his voice barely audible above the storm. 7 years ago I tried to adopt a child, a boy named Michael, whose parents died in the same accident that took Eleanor." He paused, studying the dancing flames. "The courts denied me, said I was too consumed by grief, too isolated to provide a stable home." Clara set down her teacup. She had served this man for 15 years, yet this revelation stunned her. "Is that why you've kept your distance from Lucy? You're afraid of failing her too?" Jonathan nodded, his imposing figure suddenly diminished by vulnerability. "Every time I see that little girl, I see another chance I don't deserve. What if I reach out and only make things worse? What if I can't protect her from Evelyn's schemes?" "You're not the same man you were 7 years ago," Clara said gently. "And Lucy isn't Michael." Outside, the rain intensified. In the kitchen below, they could hear Lucy helping the cook prepare dinner, a privilege Evelyn rarely allowed at the cottage, but one the child clearly cherished at the mansion. "She saved that candle, you know," Clara continued, "from her birthday cake. Keeps it wrapped in tissue paper beneath her pillow. That's not a child who's given up hope." Jonathan rose and walked to the window. The grounds of his estate stretched into darkness, as vast and empty as his life had been. "I've spent years hiding in this house, Clara, using my wife's death as an excuse to avoid connection. And yet here you are, involved despite yourself. the housekeeper replied. That little girl didn't just lose a cake. She's losing her childhood. But unlike Michael, she's still here, still within reach. Lucy's laughter drifted up from below, a sound so rare it seemed to brighten the room. Jonathan turned from the window, his decision forming. Eleanor would have loved her, he said quietly. Yes, Clara agreed. She would have. That night, Jonathan found himself lingering in the hallway outside Lucy's temporary bedroom. The door was ajar, and he could see her small form kneeling beside the bed in prayer. Not wanting to intrude, he began to retreat when her words reached him. And please look after Mr. Albright, who gave me a place to stay when Stepmom was angry. Something broke open in Jonathan's chest, a door long sealed shut. Perhaps family wasn't something you lost and mourned, but something you could build, even from the broken pieces of the past. The first snowfall of winter had transformed the riverside town into a picture-perfect scene. St. Mary's Church glowed with candlelight as the annual Christmas carol service began, voices rising in harmony beneath the vaulted ceiling. Lucy sat quietly in the back pew, her small fingers fidgeting with the hem of her coat, the only one she owned, now slightly too small for her growing frame. Earlier that day, Evelyn had cornered her in the cottage kitchen. After the holidays, you'll be going to live with my cousins in the north, she had hissed, eyes narrowed. I've had quite enough of your little stories turning the town against me. The threat had lodged in Lucy's chest like a shard of ice. As the congregation stood for silent night, the child slipped away unnoticed. The heavy wooden door closed behind her with a soft thud, and suddenly she was alone in the swirling snow. Tears froze on her cheeks as she wandered aimlessly through the deserted streets, her footprints quickly filling behind her. Inside the church, Jonathan Albright noticed her absence first. The millionaire had taken to watching over Lucy from a distance, his protective instincts growing stronger with each passing week. When the final notes of the carol faded, and she was nowhere to be seen, a cold dread settled over him that had nothing to do with the December chill. She's gone, he whispered to Clara, who immediately set down her hymnal. The news spread quickly. The service dissolved into chaos as Jonathan organized search parties, his commanding presence leaving no room for argument. Thomas, take the route to your bakery. Clara and I will check the riverside path. The rest of you, please cover the town square and residential streets. Evelyn made a show of distress, wringing her hands dramatically. She's always been difficult, always wandering off for attention, she lamented to anyone who would listen. Margaret stood beside her cousin, nodding sympathetically while shooting furtive glances at Jonathan. Outside, the wind howled mercilessly as Jonathan and Clara trudged through deepening snow. The housekeeper's face was etched with worry, memories of another child lost long ago threatening to overwhelm her. We'll find her, Jonathan assured, his voice steady despite his racing heart. He thought of the letter from his late wife, tucked safely in his breast pocket, a talisman of sorts, guiding him toward redemption. Thomas joined them at the river crossing, his baker's apron still dusted with flour. No sign of her at the shop, he reported, breath clouding in the frigid air. As darkness fell completely, the three pressed on, bound by their shared concern for the little girl who had somehow worked her way into their hearts, each step forward a testament to the family they were becoming, even as they searched for its missing piece. The search for Lucy had reached its third hour when Margaret Wilcox arrived at the church, her face flushed not from concern but from opportunity. The stone building had become the unofficial headquarters for the search parties, with worried townspeople coming and going, clutching steaming cups of tea against the winter chill. Margaret scanned the room until she spotted Reverend Phillips addressing the anxious crowd. Her eyes narrowed when she noticed Jonathan standing near the altar, his face etched with worry as he consulted a map of the town with Thomas and Clara. I think I know why the child ran away, Margaret announced, her voice cutting through the murmured conversations. All heads turned toward her. It's because of how Evelyn treats her. A hush fell over the gathering. Jonathan straightened, his attention fully captured. What exactly are you suggesting? The Reverend asked, his brow furrowed. Margaret's lips curled into what might have been mistaken for concern, but Clara recognized the gleam of satisfaction in her eyes. That poor girl's birthday cake wasn't the only thing Evelyn discarded, she said. I've seen how she speaks to Lucy when she thinks no one is watching. The harsh words, the constant criticism. She paused dramatically. Just last week I overheard her threatening to send Lucy away to relatives in Scotland. Said the child was nothing but a burden. Gasps rippled through the congregation. Thomas the baker stepped forward, His normally gentle face hardened with anger. "I've seen Lucy come to my shop with tears barely held back," he confirmed. "Always hungry, always apologizing for existing." Jonathan's jaw tightened as he exchanged glances with Clara. His housekeeper nodded slightly, confirming what they had both suspected. "Why speak of this now?" someone called out. Margaret turned, feigning innocence. "Because I can no longer bear the hypocrisy. While we search for this child, the very person who should love her most is the reason she's missing." The church doors swung open and Evelyn herself entered, her face a perfect mask of maternal concern. The sudden silence that greeted her was deafening. "What's happened?" she asked, her voice faltering as she registered the cold stares. Jonathan stepped forward. "The truth, it seems," he said quietly. Evelyn's carefully constructed facade began to crumble as whispers spread through the church. People who had once praised her charity work now recalled moments that, in retrospect, seemed suspicious. Lucy's downcast eyes at community events, her flinching at sudden movements, her pathetic gratitude for the smallest kindnesses. As Evelyn stammered denials, Margaret watched with satisfaction. Her plan to discredit her cousin had succeeded beyond expectation. Yet in her self-serving revelation, she had inadvertently done what no one else had dared. She had given the town permission to finally see the truth. And somewhere in the snowy darkness, Lucy was still missing. The winter feast was the highlight of the town's calendar, and this year, excitement rippled through the cobbled streets with unusual intensity. Garlands of holly and twinkling lights adorned shop fronts, while the great hall stood majestically at the center of preparations, its ancient stone walls soon to witness an evening that would be remembered for years to come. Jonathan Albright, no longer the shadow that haunted the edges of town life, personally oversaw the arrangements. The once reclusive millionaire moved with purpose, consulting with the organizers and insisting on one particular detail. Lucy would be seated at the head table as his honored guest. Clara watched him with quiet pride as he selected a special chair for the child, even having it cushioned with velvet. "She deserves this night," Jonathan told his loyal housekeeper, his voice soft but determined. "After everything, she deserves to feel cherished." Clara nodded, remembering the frightened girl who had hidden during the carol service. "The dress we ordered should arrive tomorrow," she said, thinking of the emerald green gown they had chosen together. Across town, in Thomas's bakery, the ovens blazed day and night. The baker had been commissioned to create the feast's centerpiece, an elaborate winter cake adorned with sugar snowflakes and silver dust. Each time Lucy visited, he let her taste the different icings, her eyes widening with delight at each new flavor. "Will there be candles?" she asked one afternoon, fingers sticky with buttercream. Thomas smiled, understanding the significance. "As many as you like," he promised. Meanwhile, Evelyn grew increasingly desperate as she felt her control slipping away. The whispers that had once been directed at Lucy now followed her instead. Margaret's betrayal at the church had started an avalanche she couldn't stop. In a last-ditch effort, Evelyn cornered Mrs. Pembroke, the vicar's wife, outside the post office. "Lucy has always been difficult," she insisted, her voice carrying just enough for passers-by to hear. "So ungrateful for everything I've sacrificed. Jonathan Albright doesn't know what he's getting himself into." But Mrs. Pembroke merely raised an eyebrow. "Strange," she replied coolly, "how a child's gratitude seems to depend on whether her birthday cake ends up on the table or in the bin." Evelyn's face flushed crimson as she realized the tide had turned completely. The townspeople, once so easily swayed by her charitable facade, now exchanged knowing glances when she passed. Her carefully constructed reputation lay in ruins, much like the cake she had so callously discarded months ago. As the feast approached, Lucy stood at Jonathan's mansion window, watching snowflakes dance in the winter air, a single candle burning beside her, not in secret this time, but proudly displayed, a beacon of hope for the night to come. The great hall of the riverside town had been transformed for the winter feast. Hundreds of candles cast a golden glow across the ancient wooden beams, their light dancing on polished silverware and crystal glasses. The tables groaned under the weight of succulent roasted meats, steaming vegetables, and rich puddings that filled the air with mouth-watering aromas. Every resident who mattered had arrived in their finest attire, the social hierarchy of the small English community perfectly preserved in their seating arrangements. Lucy sat nervously at the high table beside Clara, her small hands fidgeting with the napkin on her lap. Jonathan Albright had arranged for her to be his honored guest, a position that had set tongues wagging throughout the town. The housekeeper gave the child's hand a reassuring squeeze under the table, her eyes warm with maternal affection. From across the room, Evelyn watched with barely concealed fury. Her carefully constructed reputation had been crumbling for weeks, but she wasn't finished yet. Rising gracefully from her seat, Lucy's stepmother glided toward the high table, her voice dripping with false concern. "My poor, troubled stepdaughter," she announced loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. "Always such an imaginative child. Her stories have caused such misunderstandings." The hall grew quieter as heads turned. Margaret smirked from her table, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Thomas the baker stood near the entrance, his face tight with worry as he watched the scene unfold. "Perhaps," Evelyn continued, placing a hand on Lucy's shoulder that appeared loving but gripped too tightly, "it would be best if she returned home with me tonight." This attention has only encouraged her. The scrape of a chair cut through her words as Jonathan rose to his full height. The reclusive millionaire rarely spoke in public, and his imposing presence commanded immediate silence. His eyes, usually guarded, now burned with quiet determination. "That won't be necessary," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hushed hall. "Lucy will not be returning to your cottage." Evelyn's smile faltered. "I don't understand." "She will never be discarded again," Jonathan declared, each word measured and resolute. "From this day she is mine to protect." His hand came to rest gently on Lucy's shoulder, replacing Evelyn's grip with a touch of genuine care. The child looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and the first fragile bloom of hope. "I have filed the necessary papers," Jonathan continued. "With Lucy's consent, I intend to become her legal guardian." The silence that followed was absolute. Every face in the great hall turned toward the high table, witnessing the moment when everything changed. A collective gasp rippled through the great hall as Jonathan Albright's declaration hung in the air. Silverware clattered against china plates, and conversations halted mid-sentence. The weight of his words. "She will never be discarded again. From this day she is mine to protect," settled over the crowd like a blanket of snow, transforming the atmosphere from festive celebration to profound witness. Lucy stood frozen, her small fingers clutching the candle she had salvaged from her ruined birthday cake months ago. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked up at Jonathan, whose imposing figure now seemed less intimidating and more like a shelter from the storm that had been her life. The reclusive millionaire, once the subject of whispers and speculation, had stepped fully into the light, his reputation transforming from mysterious hermit to compassionate guardian in a single moment. Evelyn's face drained of color, her carefully constructed facade of charitable kindness crumbled as townsfolk turned to stare, their expressions shifting from shock to understanding. The stepmother who had thrown away a child's birthday cake now found herself the one being discarded by public opinion. Clara moved quietly to Lucy's side, placing a gentle hand on the girl's shoulder. The housekeeper's eyes shimmered with tears of her own, memories of the child she had lost mingling with joy for the one who would now fill the mansion with life. Thomas, standing near the back of the hall, nodded in silent approval, his risk in defending the quiet child now vindicated before the entire community. "The mansion has been silent for too long," Jonathan continued, his voice steady despite the hundreds of eyes upon him. "It's time for it to know laughter again." That very evening, Lucy walked through the grand doors of Albright Mansion not as a visitor, but as family. The imposing residence, which had stood cold and empty for years, seemed to exhale as her small footsteps echoed through its halls. Where dust and memories had reigned, warmth began to seep into every corner. Within days, the transformation was remarkable. The kitchen, once Clara's lonely domain, now filled with the scent of baking and the sound of Lucy's curious questions. The library, previously Jonathan's solitary retreat, became a place where stories were shared aloud. Even the formal gardens began to show signs of renewal, as Lucy planted flowers in spots long neglected. For the first time in years, Jonathan Albright smiled without reservation. The man who had hidden from connection found himself embracing it, his heart thawing like winter giving way to spring. And Lucy, clutching her candle no longer in sorrow but in celebration, finally felt what it meant to be home. Jonathan Albright's declaration at the winter feast had changed everything. The reclusive millionaire who once valued his privacy above all else now found himself at the center of the town's attention. As he walked through the marketplace with Lucy at his side, he nodded to neighbors who once would have received nothing more than a distant glance. The protective walls he had built around himself for years were crumbling, brick by emotional brick. "I never expected this," he confided to Clara one evening as they watched Lucy drawing by the fireplace in his mansion. "I was prepared to help her, but not for how she would help me." The loyal housekeeper smiled knowingly. "Sometimes the heart needs what it fears most," she said, her eyes reflecting the pain of her own past loss. Clara had reopened wounds she'd kept bandaged for years, sharing her grief over her lost child to help Jonathan find the courage to act. Her vulnerability had become a bridge for his own. For Thomas, the consequences of standing by Lucy had initially seemed dire. The baker had watched helplessly as customers abandoned his shop, their whispers about his poor judgment cutting deeper than any knife. But as the truth about Evelyn's cruelty spread through the riverside town, those same neighbors began to return, sheepishly at first, then with genuine appreciation. "Your cinnamon buns were worth the wait," one woman told him, placing a larger order than ever before. By week's end, Thomas could barely keep up with demand, his small bakery bustling with patrons eager to support the man who had shown kindness when others turned away. Evelyn herself faced the harshest consequences. Stripped of her carefully constructed reputation, she retreated from public life. The townspeople who had once praised her charitable nature now viewed her with suspicion and disappointment. Yet in her isolation, glimpses of understanding emerged. The woman who had thrown away a child's birthday cake had once been a child herself, crushed by rejection and mockery. "She was shaped by cruelty," Jonathan remarked to Clara. "It doesn't excuse what she did to Lucy, but perhaps it explains it." The greatest transformation, however, was in Lucy herself. The quiet, resilient child who had learned to expect disappointment now moved through the world with growing confidence. In Jonathan's mansion, she had found not just shelter, but belonging. In Clara's gentle guidance, she discovered motherly love. And in Thomas's unwavering support, she learned that kindness could prevail even when tested. The costs had been real for everyone involved, but as winter deepened, the rewards proved greater still. The great hall glowed with 1,000 candles as the winter feast neared its end. Lucy stood by the massive hearth, her small fingers clutching the single candle she had salvaged from her ruined birthday cake months ago. What had once been a symbol of loss now represented something entirely different. Jonathan Albright watched her from across the room, his usually stern expression softened by something that looked remarkably like joy. The reclusive millionaire caught her eye and nodded encouragingly. Beside him, Clara wiped away a tear, her maternal instincts fully awakened by the child who had brought warmth back to the mansion that had stood cold for so long. "Make a wish, Lucy," Thomas called out, his baker's apron exchanged for his Sunday best. The man who had risked his livelihood to show kindness now beamed with pride as the townspeople gathered around the little girl. Lucy closed her eyes, holding the moment close. The memory of sitting alone at her kitchen table with only crumbs for company seemed to belong to another lifetime. She took a deep breath and blew out the flame, sending a wisp of smoke curling toward the rafters. Applause erupted through the hall. Even Margaret, who had inadvertently set events in motion with her jealous revelations, joined in, though her eyes still darted occasionally toward Jonathan with lingering hope. "What did you wish for?" a child asked from the crowd. Lucy smiled, her quiet voice suddenly clear and confident. "I can't tell you, but I don't need to wish for a family anymore." The church bells began to toll outside, their deep resonance filtering through the stone walls. 12 solemn chimes marked midnight and the official end of the feast. Townspeople began gathering coats and scarves, exchanging final pleasantries before venturing into the crisp winter night. Jonathan approached Lucy, Clara following close behind. "Ready to go home?" he asked, the word home carrying weight that both understood. In the corner, Evelyn stood alone, her carefully constructed facade now in tatters. The woman who had once commanded respect through fear and manipulation watched as her stepdaughter walked hand in hand with Jonathan toward the massive oak doors. Lucy paused at the threshold, turning to look back at the hall where everything had changed. The emptying tables, the dying fire, the lingering scent of spiced wine and roasted meats. All of it would be remembered as the backdrop to the night when wishes came true. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the cobblestones with delicate white. The three figures, Jonathan, Clara, and Lucy, made their way through the town square, their footprints marking the beginning of a path that would continue long after the snow melted. The church bells fell, silent, but their echo remained, heralding not just the passing hour, but the start of something new for Lucy, for Jonathan, and for a town that had rediscovered the power of truth over appearances.